what should be the fundamental guidelines for what government should be doing and shouldn't be doing in our free society?
Well, I kind of go back to a first principle, and the first principle was enunciated by John Locke, who played a great role in influencing the founding fathers in writing the Constitution, and that is, each of us own ourselves. That is, we own ourselves. It's wrong for somebody to own another person. Now, if you agree that each of us owns ourselves, well, you also have to agree that in order to make self-ownership meaningful, then you must own what you produce. That is, if someone else, for example, owned 100% of what you produce, you'd be merely a slave. Now, it turns out that the average American works from January 1st until May 8th to pay federal, state, and local taxes. That is, somebody else decides how close to 5 months the fruits of his labor is used. I think that, and a lot of that is not for things that people use. That is, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 of federal expenditures constitute an activity where the government, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscates the property that belongs to one American and gives it to another American to whom it does not belong. I think that is an immoral function of government.
And Tax Freedom Day gets later every year, right? So
About
every
2
year
days.
we seem to be working longer for somebody else. And we have no choice in this. If you don't pay your taxes, you get into trouble.
We have to ask ourselves, can one make a moral case for confiscating the property that belongs to one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? Can you make a moral case? Because after all, that's what thieves do. That is, they confiscate the property of one person, or economists call it income redistribution. That's
Right.
what thieves
They
do that too.
That's right.
But can we? I think there's a basic question: can one make a moral case, or is it constitutionally authorized for the government to take that which belongs to one person and give it to another to whom it does not belong? I'm saying, like, to put it in concrete, that is, where the government takes your earnings and gives it to a farmer, or gives it to an Egyptian, or gives it to somebody else.
In a free society, people decide what they want their government to do. And one of the things that our society has decided over the years is it wants a certain amount of income redistribution. I mean, the fundamental principle in a free society should be that people should decide what it is they want their government to do. And they have settled this question, I'd say, generally, though not in the specifics that you speak.
I think we probably ought to point out that taxes are negative incentives. Anything you tax, you are going to get less of. So if you tax work or saving or driving too fast with tickets, which we like to tax speeding, or we try to, but whatever you tax, you're going to get less of. And of course, whatever you subsidize, if you have a negative tax on it, you're going to get more of. And that is an issue of redistribution, in the sense that if we're going to take money from Walter and give it to you, Bill, we have to tax him, and tax him at a different rate, obviously, than we're going to tax you. And he's wondering why we should do that. Why is that an appropriate function for government?
There's two different issues that you're raising. One is the moral question, which is what Walter's been focusing on, and also the incentive question about, will this increased tax on Walter Williams reduce his work effort or his savings? Now, I happen to know Walter Williams, and that will not happen. Walter worked just exactly as hard, whether his tax rate is high or low. So it depends. We do have to have taxes, and the incentive issues have to be addressed. But our job is really to find those places in the economy where the incentive effects will be minimized.
Frederick Bastiat wrote a little book called The Law. He's a 17th century French philosopher, and he gave us a test to decide whether government was doing something immoral or illegitimate. And he said, ask yourself the question, if I did the same thing individually, would I be condemned as a criminal? That is, for example, I could see some elderly lady sleeping out on the grate downtown Philadelphia, and I could walk up to either you or Bill, and I could come up to you with a gun, and I could say, give me your $200. Then, having gotten your $200, I could go down and help the lady, get her some housing. And now, would I be guilty of a crime? Yes, I would. Now, I'd be guilty of behaving immorally. Now, does an immoral act all of a sudden become a moral act because there's a consensus? That is, just because a majority goes for it.
Mm-hmm.
See, I disagree. I say that just because we vote for something does not establish its morality. And that's what we're trying. That's what we're talking. That's what the framers were trying to look for. They were asking, give us a government that's moral. And you find no constitutional authority for 2/3 of what our federal government is doing. The courts have ruled it constitutional, but it's not in the Constitution. I've looked carefully.
And in fact, one of the major concerns that the government had in framing the Constitution was the tyranny of the majority, and to protect the rights of minority groups and to make sure that the majority is always asking the moral question. Is this really right? Just because most of us want to vote for it because maybe we benefit from it. And that's certainly a very, very interesting issue. Well, one of those transfers that's taking place, I mean, we do have subsidies to farmers and subsidies to the housing industry, for example.
College students.
College students. We have a lot of subsidies that are built into the federal system. And another big transfer that's been taking place that we have to raise taxes for, that's become very controversial, and that is interest on the debt. And the deficit. Certainly the deficit has become one of the major issues in the last decade or so.
The most recent data that I was just looking at in Dr. Dunkelberg's office indicates that we're still sputtering along, and there may be a genuine need for the new president to pursue a more expansionary fiscal policy, which may of necessity mean an increase in the deficit. And maybe that's, I guess what I'm saying is that there may be more important issues facing the American people than just the matter of the deficit and how much interest we pay on it.
Of course, in early 1990, we employed a record high percentage of the population, I think 63.1%. Never has a high percentage of our people been employed before. We had a record high percentage of the population with 2 jobs. We were certainly fully employed. We couldn't have, if more jobs had been demanded, we couldn't staff them.
Right.
We'd hired everybody we could get to work.
Right.
And yet the deficit was hundreds of billions of dollars at that point in time. So certainly the economy was fully utilized at that time, and yet there we were running these amazing deficits.
Well, it was not because of revenues. We were engaging in bread and circuses, that we were just spending, and we will never get the deficit under control until we find out what to do with spending. Now let's look at the record. I mean, within the last 30 years, we've had one balanced budget, I believe in 1969 or 68. Now, in 1974, we had the Budget Control Act that was supposed to get the deficit under hand. In 1978, we had the Balanced Budget Act, which made balanced budget a law of the land. Then, of course, we all remember the Graham-Rudman Act that was supposed to get the deficit down to 0 by 1992. And then we remember the 1986 the largest tax increase in U.S. history at the time, which was called the down payment on the deficit. Then we had the 1990 budget deal that was supposed to have the 5-year deficit reduce it, the $500 billion 5-year deficit reduce it to 0, and instead it's over $1 trillion now. And all this time, taxes have been going up. We'll never deal with the deficit until we can get government back into the bottle. That is, to get the federal government doing its constitutionally authorized functions.
Don't you think this, though, is tied to a very unrealistic view of the electorate? I mean, I feel that the electorate is largely to blame for this, in the sense that we are a nation of people who want the government to do something for us, and we want someone else to pay for it. And this idea just is pervasive in the society, and it makes it very difficult for the elected representatives of the electorate to deal with the problem that you described.
Oh, you're 100% correct. That is, Americans are getting exactly what we're asking for.
Right.
That is,
we want something for nothing.
We can't blame politicians, because politicians are merely doing what Americans tell them to do. And what do Americans tell politicians to do? They say, we're going to elect you to the Senate or to the state legislature to use the power of your office to confiscate the property that belongs to one American and
give
bring
it
it
to
back.
us.
Bring it home.
Exactly right. And indeed, if you look at the trends in tax revenues over time, Americans are not really in the tax burden that's falling on a typical American, if you combine state and local taxes, has not really increased all that much So in many respects, these concerns seem to me a little bit exaggerated when you put them into a temporal and spatial context.
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether temporal, because at the turn of the century, in 1902,
Right.
the average American paid $60 a year in federal,
Right.
state, and local taxes. And in fact, they worked, I think, something like not quite a month. But one of the reasons why, if you say, look, our taxes are much lower than the rest of the world, industrialized nation. Well, no wonder the rest of the world wants to buy America. That is, they're rushing to bring their capital over here.
Right.
They're willing to invest in America because we have a more robust economy as a result of the lower tax rate. So I'm not willing to say, look, let's be like Sweden.
A lot of us feel we're paying taxes and we're not getting
Anything in value
anything
in
in
return.
value in return.
Right.
And that, of course, I think creates the incentive problem and the whole issue of confiscation. And
That's right. To go into debt, for our nation to go into debt to fight World War II, nobody can object to that. I mean, that was an essential task, and it made future generations better off. It was an investment.
That's right.
in
That's
the
exactly
future.
right.
Today, we're going into debt, and it's just for bread and circuses. It's for today's consumption. There's no cash flow coming back from it.